Now, this is not something which is new. And again, I'm very confident that many of you on this call will already be aware of this. So, I'm not intending to patronize at all. Um, and I know that somebody recently said to me, I think you might have missed the boat on this. I don't think I've missed any boat. My view of the fact of how students, Chinese students, have often been labelled in the past, I'm well aware that it still exists. I hear it all the time. So I was kind of thinking, have I missed the boat? Well, no, because a lot of literature exists out there about this. But as far as I'm concerned, even if I've only got 5 students, Chinese students coming through the door, I need to know, what do we do about this, because it still exists. So the large culture approach, and again, there are others, we haven't got time to go through that today, in looking at common classroom behavioural characteristics, is that students are regularly labelled, and they're always labelled this way by some people, of course, and not everybody, thank goodness, as lacking. They're burdened with deficits. They rely heavily on rote learning and memorization. Then we can see she, who challenges labels such as receptive, passive, I don't know how many times I've actually heard that label. They're disciplined, they learn by imitation, and they're reproductive rather than analytical. And again, I know many of you here on the call are actually based in China, so you might not all be talking like this, but it's still there, and we need to work out what we can do about it. Wu questions labels such as dependent and silent. And again, I'll share a little story that the first time when I taught in Chengdu, I remember I'd been teaching Greek students who were very lively in Greece. And I did arrive in China, in Chengdu, and I was faced with lots of students that I was guilty of stereotyping. And I was kind of saying, but they're all silent, they're all obedient, they're all, and then I grew with time, into professional development, engaged in intercultural communication, and became a different person, I suppose, with different views. And interesting, I think, Wu mentions here that often our Western students are not dependent and silent, they're actually deeply analytical and speculative, and therefore considered to be better learners. And we'll look at the findings and see how the students feel within this. Now, as I've only got my big screen in front of me, I can't see if anybody's nodding off so far, but hopefully not. So let's just have a little look before we go on to the findings of what the tensions are within this arena. And again, I'm kind of thinking there's a lot of research out there on EAP, and there's a lot of research on Chinese students. And I'm trying very much to bring this together and also to link it with recent Chinese education reforms, which actually tells us something quite interesting. So having a quick look at the homogenization of Chinese students and associated tensions, I'm aware that even by doing this, I'm almost homogenizing Chinese students, but this is the only way that I can manage this and to try to raise awareness. So we'll have a look at these particular tensions just briefly. I'm hoping some of you will recognize some of these points. I've often heard over the years, and again, I've often been guilty of it myself, of sort of saying, right, our Chinese students, they're just not participating in class. And one of the reasons could be that they're fearful of interrupting the teacher. It's a common problem. How do we do this? Some of us are more skillful at this than others. I'm not saying that's me, by the way. But how do we work with our Chinese students? Common justification is that Chinese students think of the teacher as somebody who's just the embodiment of knowledge. In that instance, it makes them feel authoritarian, unapproachable. That might be the case in certain instances. So, this is just what I've been sort of researching. It's going to be different in different institutions. It's going to be different in different places in China also. So they're unapproachable. Now, there is a discussion that challenges this, that says actually Chinese teachers are considered to be warm and friendly. They've got a high quality of mutual respect and responsibility in China. And often the reason that this might be a case if they're looking unapproachable is because they've got to manage large group sizes of up to 80. So it's classroom management strategies. Be interesting to see what the findings bring up here. Critical thinking is such a big area, and all I ever hear is how can we get them to think critically. I find it a little bit tedious actually, but obviously it's there, and it's something that we are responsible for, I suppose. So a common tension is that Chinese students struggle to engage in critical thinking. A common justification is that they've simply got an inability to think critically. It's so far remote from their own cultural beliefs and values. That was Atkinson, and obviously referring there to Chinese society and approaches. This is a big area, and when I think also about recommendations, I think it's a piece that needs to be picked up by some critical thinking scholars. It's not necessarily my area of specialism, but it does concern me every time I hear the fact that they just don't know what it is. I don't really think that's the case. The discussion, which I've actually included in the thesis, obviously talks about Chinese education reforms. It indicates something quite different. Again, if you're interested in that, then I do recommend that you research that further. What are they doing in China at the moment? In fact, for a number of years, they've been trying to instill critical thinking, critical engagement, etc., along with independent learning and so on and so forth. Musavi, which I find quite interesting, critiques literature that frames pretty much all East Asian students into being unable to engage in critical thinking. And in that instance, they're considered intellectually deficient by some in comparison to their Western counterparts. This links to Musavi's interpretation of aspects of Edward Said's Orientalism. And again, Orientalism is a huge area, and there's so much more to it than this. This is a simplification of it. But Said, when talking about the Oriental in an Orientalist viewpoint, is often seen as depraved and different in comparison to the rational and virtuous European. And these are the feelings I have regularly when we're working with Chinese students in certain contexts. Writing, a common problem is why are so many Chinese students sadly getting involved in plagiarism, collusion, etc. Obviously, we've now got AI, which is another big fish, slightly different area, even though it's linked. And I see many students sitting in front of me because of academic misconduct issues, often not related to direct cheating, but other things. We all know about that. And a common justification is that they're just prone to mimicking Western practices, academic discourses, because that's what they're used to doing, sort of mimicking and memorizing rather than producing authentic work. A discussion is, there's not too much of a challenge around this. It's more a case of saying, give people a break, look at what we're asking students to do in such short periods of time, who arrive, as in many international students do, in fact, many home students would have the same issue, unfamiliar with academic discourse patterns and conventions. It's going to take time to get used to that. We all know that. And, they don't really know anything at this stage about authorship. There's some interesting work on thought patterns and also subjective integrated method of writing. So, where Chinese students might be taught in a more circular manner, they look at background before main point presentation of ideas. Again, that's another big area, and I do cover that quite a bit in the theses, but we can't look at that in too much detail here either. But these are the tensions, and I'm sure some of you probably will be familiar with some of these. And then we've got oral communication, and again, that kind of links back to the teacher-student relationship. How do we really encourage our chat? Does it matter if a Chinese student is sitting there and they're completely silent? Well, this is what we need to cover. Does it mean they're not learning? Potentially not. Are they being unwilling? We have to look at that and think probably not in most cases. And they're not used to being able to speak up in class in China, not necessarily because of fear, but potentially because you've got huge class sizes. A bit of research on they like to respect science and attentive listening. So this is the background to the whole of the thesis. Now, I didn't necessarily go into the study saying, shall I focus on these and shall I ask focus questions of the participants? you'll actually find as we have a look at it, the data really came through in a way that I hadn't planned, and I found it really fascinating. Moving on just very quickly on this part, and again, it's mainly just in case anybody's interested in looking further at this. So we tend to, or some people tend to put, a group of students with all the same learning characteristics. They're not individuals at all. And it makes them different to other people within the group. It's often linked to a Confucian heritage culture, so CHC connection, and the common Western, many, and I'm not saying yours, but many common Western interpretations is that a Confucian education focuses only on memorization and recitation of texts and the passing of exams, and that moves through into where we are now. However, I like the following quotation from Clark and Jeeve, which is looking at the Western large culture discourse, and they suggest that it continues to be steered by Western instructors, that rather than being interrogated for ethnocentric bias and stereotyping, are validated by recourse to a Confucian heritage explanation, which appears plausible rather than being empirically established. Great area to look into if ever you have time, or you may already be experts in that area. So let's just have a quick look. And I'm sorry this is not particularly interactive, but I did think with the content we wouldn't have time. We might not even want to go into breakout groups. We might be able to pop things in the chat, which might be quite interesting. But let me now talk to you about what came through from the data. So keep in mind that I was really trying to get the stories of the students, of the participants. Limitations, obviously, I only had 6 and a number of interviews, and then I analysed it by doing thematic analysis. Not sure I'll ever do that again because it took forever, but I got there in the end, I suppose. I was never sure, am I doing this right? You should never think about it that way. So 3 core themes. One was motivations. I'm not going to look at that in detail here today because we haven't got time, but it was all about extrinsic, intrinsic, etc. But what was interesting most of all was experiencing education China and the UK. And it kind of came through that as I was listening to the stories, the participants were naturally doing a comparison between China and the UK. So, none of the questions were saying, what's the difference? They were naturally making that comparison, hardly surprising, I suppose. And also critical thinking. Again, I didn't say to any of the students, what do you know? What do you understand by critical thinking? It was very much, how do you think the AES module approaches critical thinking? And then all sorts of weird and wonderful things came through. I was going to suggest maybe we pop in the chat what you think the data revealed. I'm not sure we'll have time for that. We could maybe have a chat about it at the end. Carol, are you still there?
I am indeed, yes.
Do you think we should put anything in the chat or leave it until the
Do you maybe want to leave to the end?
Yeah, because we've got a number of people here and we might end up with a book.
Yeah, and
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Just because some people want to leave.
Okay,
Probably
let me carry
good
on.
to get
I'm